A single bolt cleaved the black above Baradur, and the thunder that followed tasted of iron and sea. Lightning ran like a spear across that sentinel of shadow and lanced the unblinking eye. For the briefest instant, the tower answered with a sound as if the world had forgotten itself. A groan that swallowed wind and bird and the loosed breath of men. Where the flash struck, the stone seemed to blush as if with old blood, and the dark smoke that crowned the tower curled back from the wound like something living recoiling. All around, Mordor sat like a wound in the earth. Ashen flats that drank light, rivers gone to steam, and fields where no green memory remained. The air itself lay heavy, as if malice had weight, and where it touched a man it chilled with the sense of being long remembered and not forgiven. This was no battlefield of shouted names and clashing steel. Here the land breathed shadow, and the shadow answered, if anyone named hope. In such a place Thor, newcomer and Thundermaid, felt his bones register a new cold, not of ice, but of intent. He came like weather-made flesh. One moment there was only a roving storm to the west, a fret of cloud and distant rumble. The next, there stood a figure in that ruined plain, hammer-clasped cloak and hair like something the sky had vomited down. Thor. Mjolnir hung in his hand, small as a promise and heavy as a world. He smelled sea salt and iron, and behind them, the old musk of battle. He had known ruin before, and he had known the feel of armies breaking, of kings fallen and songs ending, but never had he stood where desolation seemed to feed the stone itself. He set his feet as a man sets a plow in frost. His first look was not of wonder, but of statistic. Towers, fields, black peaks, and then a pause, as though his throat had caught on a thought not his own. He had thought lightning a familiar friend, lance, answer, hammer's echo. He did not at first grasp that here thunder could be a language not of wind and earth, but of dominion, a speech the tower spoke back. When the eye burned at him again, it no longer seemed a mere beady gaze upon the plain. It brimmed with purpose. It was a will, and that will took offense. So he hurled the first storm into the dark. The bolt came from his arm more than from the heavens, a concentrated point of white that found purchase in the air and then unfurled like a banner. It struck the eye, and the tower answered with a shudder that moved the very horizon. Windows of rock opened and shut like eyelids, and somewhere within the basalt heart, a sound rolled up that was half metal and half remembered thunder. The lightning did not merely mar the stone it sought, like all true lightning, the quick and secret paths that carry heat and heart. It sought the source of power. Behind that horrid gaze, Sauron felt it, and when Sauron felt aught, he answered with a swiftness unequaled. The attention that the Dark Lord had kept diffuse, watching armies, listening to whispers, holding in a great and patient hunger, snapped as a cord unto a single point. The eye sharpened. Where before it had been a threat at a far horizon, it now turned a hot personal glare upon the stranger who had split the sky. The land itself bowed its head. In that turning smoke went still, and the small living noises that scuttle and sing fell silent as if waiting a sentence. From the west came voices that did not belong to Thor, but still cared for his choice. Far off upon a ridge, a gray-cloaked figure felt the disturbance like a note struck wrong and read it with a throat that knew storms better than most. Gandalf felt fire in the air and stepped as one who walks upon a trembling bridge, his staff clutched. He did not speak aloud. His eyes were the kind that count the cost of thunder. Beside him stood those who would stand for Middle-earth. Aragorn, with the weight of a crown yet to be taken in his posture, men and hobbits in ragged courage, every living heart drawn to that sudden and terrible light. They did not know the names of the gods Thor carried in his veins, but they knew the language of crisis, and their faces set like flint. Thor's hammer thrummed. It sang a low old song that matched the lightning and bound it close. Where he placed his will, the storm obeyed. Where he drew back, thunder returned to the clouds. He knew the rules of his craft. The strike given returns to the hand. The fury unleashed circles back. Yet in that instant, the tower reached with more than stone, with a cunning of will that could fasten lightning to thought. The bolt that had gone forth found purchase in the eye and did not go where storms should go. It rooted as if a hook had been driven into the sky, and for the first time, Thor felt a resistance not of axe or shield, but of command. The One Ring lay far from that moment, an object of small size and vast web. Yet the chain that bound it was also a chain of will, woven from dominance and fear and a cruelty ancient as labor and sharper. The question born in Thor's chest was simple and monstrous. Could a god-sized fury break such a chain without sunder? Could lightning unweave the knotted wills that kept men trembling? Could the stroke of a hammer shatter a design that had been built on patient ruin? He had not come to judge, he had come to answer. Still, even as the thought burned, the land around him answered with tremor. Barad-dûr gathered itself, as if recalling all the hands that once raised it. Stones slid like teeth, and loopholes threw back light that had not been seen for ages. From its black lips there came a voice not of human tongue, but of many echoes, a pressure against the mind like wind against a shuttered door. The strike of Thor did not go unanswered by flesh alone. Riders there were, shadows with sounds of bells, and they took wing as if in answer. The Nazgûl rose, their shrieks cutting the air, drawn by the new scent of fire. Their appearance made the plain fold its hands and pray for a mercy it had despaired of. Thor felt this turn as a bind. A storm might be summoned, and quelled thunder might be unmade at will. Here the weather would not be so easily let go. The eye's gaze had fastened upon him, and the tower's reply was more than echo. When a will is met by another, each rubs at the other until one gives, and the giving is not always in the shape one expects. He had struck retreat was no mere lowering of arm. The bolt, once loosed and anchored, pulled at him with a leash of intent. To draw back now might rend the air that had been cut, might tear open seams in reality that Thunder God and Steward alike had not felt before. Men on the ridge watched, and their faces were lit by unnatural white. Gandalf's hand moved like a slow wind, measuring, weighing, as if the old wizard could hear the precise note of a breaking world. Aragorn shifted, and those near him read in that motion a command to ready spear and sword. The hobbits clutched each other. None could know the counsel in Thor's mind. None could know whether a single stroke could mend their doom or deepen it. Yet they knew action when they saw it, and their hearts prepared to follow whatever shape that action took. Thor stood with Mjolnir at arm's length, and the storm half congealed about it, and in that posture the fate of many hung, not only the fate of the ring or of Barad-dûr, but of fields and rivers beyond, and of small hands that had yet to set seed. He could feel the eye like a hand on his brow, a weight seeking to instruct. He could feel the pull of his own blood, the memory of storms called to answer his call. He could feel, too, the trembling of those who watched. He breathed in a wind tasting of iron and sea, and then he made a decision that was more of a commitment than the word would hold, to press the storm until the tower showed its answer, whatever shape it took. And so the first thunder was not a question, but a promise made and kept, and the promise bent the world. The eye, now riveted, leaned wholly to a single foe. The plain, that had been a patient thing, shuddered in expectation. Men and wizards and a storm-made god all stood at the pivot. What would be unmade and what would be saved hung on the next motion of hand and hammer. Thor lifted as if to strike again, and in that raising there was no half-heartedness. There was only the knowledge that some blows cannot be taken back. The bolt struck like a verdict. Stone flaked away in a silver storm, and the ramparts of the dark tower shuddered as if their bones had been jarred loose. Iron grates that had shrugged at catapults and boils' corches split along seams and ran with molten veins. 100 banners that had hung black as night snapped and showered down in sparks. The thunder did not merely crack the air, it tore a new shape into it. Men half a mile away felt it in their teeth. The very air tasted of iron and old promises broken. At first, it seemed the summoning had done what thunder always promises: to rend, to scatter, to make a path. But the ring answered not as any living voice would, nor like a mind that bargains, but like hunger refined into craft. The flash did not boil off the shadow of the one the flash was taken. Where the bolt struck and where it fell, a thin, terrible brightness gathered as if a hand cupped it. Light that should have gone winging across the sky bent toward a small, insatiable point and was swallowed clean. The stones smoked. The wind stopped its sighing and listened. Those who had not known lightning before saw the theft with naked fear. Soldiers who had felt the hammer of storm on other fields remembered what lightning does, and their mouths went dry at the sight. The wizard's eyes, pale under his hood, narrowed like a blade passed to a whetstone. The ring did not glow like a common jewel. It drew power with the slow, certain greed of tides seeking a new bed. Siphoned energy crawled along invisible threads toward it, and in that drawing, the air about the ring trembled with new will. The Nazgûl stirred as if from sleep. They had ridden the last of the long black roads for ages, and their hunger had long been a thing of shadow and command. Now, under the new currents, they moved with a change that bespoke hunger sharpened by borrowed fire. Riders who had been cold and distant came suddenly close to one another like wolves smelling fresh blood. Their horses, black as a spilled night, stamped anxious hooves and snorted, and the riders' heads turned as if listening to a sound only they could hear. The rings, taking of that lightning, spun something in them, and it was not merely more strength they tasted, it was direction. Thor felt the change in his chest like a counterstrike. Lightning is a language to him, as bread is to a child, and in its taking, the ring spoke back. He had expected resistance, perhaps a pull at his arm, a jolt of defiance. Instead, there came a sense of negotiation. The bolt that had been his became a bargaining coin. In the instant after the flash, the hammer in his hand felt oddly lighter, and yet whatever touch remained seemed laced with threads that did not belong to him. A chill ran down his spine, not cold, but like a needle of purpose. He felt the ring tasting him and tasting his thunder, and the taste pleased it. It is a strange and awful thing to see one's own violence redirected. Thor had sent fire to break stone. The ring sipped that fire and returned a twist. Where earlier the storm had scattered defenders and carved a route, now the air itself seemed to knot around the ring's will. A gust rose and fell as if someone were drawing breath across the metal, and the Nazgul's faces, if faces they could be called, turned with an intent that no banner commanded. They were not merely drawn, they were guided. Each subsequent flash, instead of making the field wider, made a path narrower and more certain toward where the ring lay. Those near the tower cried out, some in wonder, some in fear, but their cries went thin against the new music of the storm. The rain that followed the strikes was not wet so much as salting. It fell in bright grains that smelt of burnt wire and old iron. Torches guttered and reignited without wind. Shields blackened at the edges with a quick, hungry soot, and men felt their belts loosen as though some unseen hand sorted armor without thought for the wearer. The ring's hunger was not a thing that moved with hands. It altered the weather around it like an ill-spoken name warping a man's face. Thor's voice, when he spoke, was low and far from thunder. He had never been given to long words, but seeing the ring drink thunder changed the tenor of what he knew. He called not to the wind, but to the understanding of his own making. Smoke, spark, the arc that runs from cloud to stone. He tested the law of storm again and again in short, sharp summonses, each flash a question, each roar a hammering at the answer he sought. The ring took each answer and folded it into itself as a weaver takes yarn, and with each taking it seemed to grow less a ring and more a listening mouth. The Nazgul were close now, and their whispering order moved like a scent through the ranks of the defenders. Those who had felt some small mercy from the storm before now found it changed into a narrowing noose. Riders that had been merely curious now urged their mounts with a new frenzy, their cries a rasp that cut the night skin. Iron-bound gates that had already been scored by lightning crackled as if with hunger, and in the burst of splintered wood and twisted metal there came the sound of something exultant, a chittering like scales rubbing, and the horses recoiled as if stung. Around him others read the same omens with different faces. Some turned to flight with the pale, quick decisions of men who see the tide's edge collapse. Others gripped their weapons with a steadiness born of places unafraid of falling. One old voice, low and grave, a chord strung across other times, spoke and named what Thor could only feel. The ring hates foreign fire. It swallows what it will, and then it repurposes that power to seduce and to steer. To feed it was to feed a hunger that comprehends ways to use the fed like a smith uses a newly wrought blade. This knowledge cut Thor like cold iron. The hammer in his grip hummed with familiarity, but familiarity could be a trap. Power you know makes you bold, but there are powers that are mirrors, and the ring reflected back his thunder, altered and sharpened toward its ends. He could feel an inclination begin to slither into his thoughts, small at first. Suggestions of where the storm could be turned, how a strike could be made most devastating. The suggestions were not his, and yet they felt plausible, with an immediacy that made his jaw ache. There was a choice, as of a path split by smoke. Press on, and the storm might break the tower more completely, but each strike fed the ring a currency it could spend on others. Withdraw, and the Black Riders would gain time to close, unhurried and directed. Around the ring, the world rearranged itself. Stones leaned away from its light. Men stepped as though their boots were compelled to mark territory around that small, greedy thing. The farther the storm flared, the more the ring drew eyes and wills to it, like a beacon that calls not to ships, but to the predators of the deep. Thor set the hammer down for a breath, feeling the shortness of his own pulse in the pause. The sky was still loud with the remnants of what had been called down. Somewhere inside the tower, something laughed in a voice that could not be heard, but could be felt like a tremor through the soles of one's feet. The Nazgul's intent was now no longer to merely serve a ring that was a legend. It was to collect the new kind of fuel the ring had learned to love. Riders began to gather, a darker ring than before, circling with an efficiency that suggested plans already made. The choice demanded a shape. Thor had not come to Middle-earth to be weapon or to be meal. The knowledge of how the ring fed on thunder forced his mind to carve a new answer. He could not simply stop the storm. To do so might leave the world to siege and whisper. He could not keep slinging bolts indiscriminately. Instead, the hammer in his hand felt like a weighing scale, and what he weighed was not stone, but consequence. He raised his head toward the tower and toward the riders, jockeying in the dark. He felt the gravity of the ring's notice shift. The center of attention moved a little more like a tide, pulling toward his own heart. He moved not with a lord's stride, but with the measured steps of one who must now tempt an enemy with bait and not with blunt force. He would draw the Nazgul's new hunger away from the tower if he could, and keep the storm close but contained. Lightning could be a blade or a leash. The decision set him upon a course that would test whether a thunderer could hold his own storm in leash, and whether a ring that had long fed on desire could be tricked into chasing the wrong hunger. As he took his first step, the air tightened, and the Nazgul lifted their heads as if some distant bell had been struck. The storm listened, the ring listened, and the riders began to turn their mounts with the slow, certain orientation of wolves smelling the line where prey breathes. The bolt met stone and shadow as if two old enemies had at last found their perfect reckoning. Light shivered along the buttresses of Barad-dûr, and a high keening rose, not of voice but of will, a sound that set steel teeth grinding and turned the blood in veins to quicksilver. For a heartbeat, the dark tower stuttered, hairline fissures sprang like lightning in glass, and the sky itself took a wound into which smoke poured. At the heart of that wound, Sauron's presence flared, not as a shape, but as a conscience of smoke and intent, hungry, patient, and ferocious all at once. The tower answered with a thunder of collapsing ash. Molten seams showed through like brazen veins. Far away, Mount Doom drew breath that burned the air, and from its throat came the restless whisper of the ring. The ring, far below in the furnace of the world, felt the storm and reached for it with a cunning older than any metal. It did not call with words, but with desire made visible, a subtle curling of heat and gold that sought purchase on thunder. Lightning, which is usually a thing of directionless fury, found itself bending as if pulled along cords. Bolts braided together into ordered lances, and the storm began to arrange itself like ranks on a field. Where the ring's influence touched the clouds, flashes took on the pallor of melted gold, and the air tasted faintly of iron and enslavement. Thor felt it as a wrongness in the hammer's weight, a small and terrible discord he could not name at once. Mjolnir hummed beneath his grip like a bird that both wanted and feared to fly. Its head thrummed with a rhythm not wholly his. He had called down thunder to cleave shadow, not to be cleaved to another will. The runes along the hammer's haft glowed dimly, and within that pale light a thread of something like voice slithered. It was no language he understood, but the hammer answered with motions and memories older than speech. Mjolnir began, imperceptibly at first, to tilt toward the dark tower as if steered by a hand unseen. Those who watched from ridgelines and ruined watchtowers fell silent at the sight, for men and elves and darker folk know the look of a weapon that ceases to be a mere tool. Even the wind hesitated. Soldiers lowered spears and held breath as though it were a thing that could be stolen. The earth itself seemed to recoil, gravel grinding as if under the foot of a giant. Over the plains, the thunder did not grow, but instead became ordered, a percussion arranged to rhythms not of war, but of coronation. Where earlier lightning had struck to rend and unmake, now bolts conjoined, uniting in arcs that described sigils of dominion around Barad-dûr. From the furnace at Mount Doom, the ring sent no direct command, for it lacks speech and speaks rather by yearning. Yet yearning is a law of the world and moves more surely than 1,000 shouted edicts. The storm answered as a mind would answer. A summons clouds coalesced into banners, lightning stitched itself into chains. They were not chains of iron, but of compulsion, and when they struck the tower, they fused to the cracked masonry like molten writing. The seams of stone, closed over runes of power smoke, gathered into a black helm of thought, newly sharpened. Sauron's essence, once diffused into the long shapes of shadow, concentrated like a steel speck in the eye of a storm. Thor fought with the simplest, oldest resource he had, force of will and the feel of the hammer in his hand. He planted his feet and drew back that inner tether of command by which Thy had always guided Mjolnir. The hammer resisted as a captive dog might resist its master, whining with light. Sparks ran between the ring's golden hunger and the head of Mjolnir like ants along a live wire. Each spark was not merely electricity, but a tiny oath bent to a greater purpose. The more Thor resisted, the more the hammer seemed to test the limits of its own allegiance, as if it believed itself free even as it obeyed another. It is one thing for a sword to be taken from a hand, another for a hammer to choose to obey. Sauron's attempt to bind Thor's power had not anticipated the peculiar intimacy of a god's weapon with its bearer. Mjolnir's loyalty had been forged in storms and feasts, sealed with the laughter of thunder and the sweat of battle. To tug at it was to tug at memory, at every oath Thor had ever sworn with iron in his fist. Yet power answers power, and when the ring reached with its golden intent, it did so through a grammar older than race or realm. The hammer heard echoings of promises made in a hot pit below the world, promises that promised dominion and the quiet of all wills knotted into one. Around Barad-dûr, the earth split further, and from the new wounds a smell came sharp and metallic, like the inside of a bell heated till it sang. The bolts that struck the battlements did not shatter them so much as melt them into symbols. Shadows flowed up from those symbols as if freed from old chains, and where they flowed they took on a shape, an armature of will that leaned outward into the world. From that armature came a radiance that was not light, but the convincing of light. It made things seem proper that were not proper. Men who saw it felt a sudden comprehension of order, a sense that this making of bonds was both inevitable and right. Thor's face, lit by the swinging aurora of battle light, did not accept that right. He felt inside him a heat like a forge, a countervoice that would not yield. He began to chant in an old tongue, a chant that is not so much heard as felt, a roll of syllables that tightened the hammer's leash. Mjolnir answered for a moment and leapt inward toward his fist with the violence of an animal returning to its master. For that breath, the world brightened, and the linked light over Barad-dûr flared as if insulted. Then the ring showed its cunning. It did not yank the hammer from Thor, but it edged him, shifted his aim, and planted the seed of an idea so simple and so dangerous that no blade had foreseen it. What the ring sought was not merely to make Thor a herald or a siege engine. It sought to turn the very nature of thunder into proclamation, to teach lightning to carry a command, and to crown Sauron not by force alone, but by the binding of others' wills through awe. If one great hammer could be made to answer the ring, what would stop the storm from becoming a chain for all who dwelt beneath it? What would stop the sky from learning obedience? The thought slid across the faces of those who watched like a cold map of future enslavement. Fear in them was not only for their own bodies, but for a greater, subtler loss, the loss of surprise, the losing of rebellion's first bright spark. Mjolnir tilted again, this time more decisively, as if feeling the tug beneath Thor's ribs. Lightning braided about its head like a circlet finding its place. Thor's arm trembled muscle, and Will struggled in silence. A small, distant weeping rose from the ash beds around Mount Doom, for the land itself grieved at the notion of thunder yoked. The watchfires in the lowlands guttered as if even flame feared the new order. In the teeth of that moment, allies who could not come to blows found a single terrible thought. That weapon turned could make even freedom's cry sound like obedience. Thor did not yield. He tightened his fingers until knuckles gleamed white. Then, with a movement that broke the very shape of the storm, he did what no one of flesh alone could do. He threw himself forward, an act of body that was also an act of will, toward the tower, as if he might physically wrest the hammer's course from its theft. The hammer began to move in his hand, pulled by two fevers at once, one of his making, the other of the ring's. Around him, the storm-replied clouds churned into a funnel that pointed like a finger, and the lightning that had learned order now seemed to learn desire. As Thor plunged, every eye that could see followed him, and every heart that still beat without dread found its rhythm again for an instant. Mjolnir's head shone with a double flame, the colder white fire of summoned thunder and the smoldering gold of domination's hunger. Between these fires hung a thin, newly formed strand of light that curved toward the dark tower. It was not yet a bond, but it was being drawn, a promise made on both sides. Thor's shoulder bore the lag of the hammer's will. He would not let it swing true upon Barad-dûr, he resolved, even if that meant he must break his own arm to do so. The world waited, poised on a single, dangerous intent, and in that pause the ring whispered no words, but sent into the air a question that demanded an answer of flesh, fate, and thunder. The sky above the black land had lost the last of ordinary weather. It boiled instead, a high bell-like rumble under the clouds, as if the very air had been hammered thin and now struck with mallet and anvil. Men of Gondor, and those few who still clung to hope, stood along the far rim of the plain and watched that bell toll. Their faces were pale ovals in the rainlight, mouths tight with prayer or command. The mastheads of siege engines creaked. The grass near their feet lay flat, beaten by a wind that tasted of iron and old smoke. Thor held his hammer like a weary king holds the scepter of a country in late winter. The head of Mjolnir thrummed in his grip as if some small heart beat within it. He felt the song, the ring's small, silver song, curl against the hammer and press like a hand at the door. He could have answered with the storm outright. He had stood on cliff edges of worlds where the sky was torn in, too, and had laughed as lightning braided itself about his wrists. He knew the thunder's joy. It was a clear white thing that loved to break and be broken and break again. To summon such joy here would have been to split Barad-dûr open like a shell. Men would have called it salvation. The land itself would have been rent. Rivers would boil in their beds. The very stones of Ithilien might have steamed away, and the children of the earth would have lost fields and forests to the God-forged rain. That was the first temptation, swift, bright, a pure blade. The second temptation had a voice like silk. The ring, though hidden at Sauron's heart, sang a countersong, not of destruction, but of binding. It would take the storm and teach it a new cadence. It would redraw the lightning's runes until the hammer sang its own doom, until thunder learned to obey. Between those two tempers, Thor felt the thing he had never felt before in all his thunder, fear for more than muscle. He feared what would happen if he gave a godlike instrument over to a ring that made slaves of kings. He feared the quiet work of corruption, the way small whirls of song could sharpen into a pattern and then into a law. Yet fear flowered with choice. If he did less, if he held back his hand, Sauron's moldering will might only grow stronger. The watchers in the plain would watch and die a little more inside their ribs. The choice rested in the center of his chest like an iron coin. He had been called a storm, and he had been called a weapon. Neither title pleased him, but both were true. Then he took action. That was not a cry and not a withdrawal, but a forging of a new word. He set Mjolnir lightly upon the ground between him and the dark tower, and the earth answered with a small shudder. The hammer sank half a hand into the soil as if the world received it like a peg. He did not raise his arms to the clouds and call the lightning down as before. Instead, he bent and put his forehead to the haft. The rain caught his hair and turned it to a darker silver. He closed his eyes and listened to the hammer's voice, to the little song that had traveled in bone and iron since before men had names for thunder. He gave it something that was not thunder, but something like a parting, an offering. It was no theatrical sacrifice. He drew breath as one draws a rope taut. The hammer drank that breath. A white current slid from his mouth into the wood and iron, and for the first time it felt like a hand reaching into his life. Light moved along the hammer's face in a tight braid, and the braid arced out as if it had lusted to go the other way, to crash upon the tower. But instead it curved, thin and deliberate, and found a chord in the air. The ring answered like a listening throat. The sound they made together was not thunder yet. It was nearer to a bell struck underwater, long, slow, and full of a promise that could be mercy or killing. The braided light gathered itself into a column, and the column shot west, splitting the sky between it and the tower. Where it met the air nearest Barad-dûr, it coiled like a living rope and hooked itself about the tower's mast of shadow. Those who watched saw a lightning lash wrap the dark tower. It did not strike and shatter the walls. Rather, it laid itself along them like a ribbon, and from the ribbon sprang other threads. They wound like iron vines across stone and curtain. Men who had never heard such a sound said afterward that the sky itself had been plaited and yoked. The thing that had been only Thor's thunder now hummed with a foreign music. In that music lay a twin intent: bind and to bind be bound. The people clasped their hands and strained their necks. The captains of Gondor glowered and whispered. A woman, old, wrapped in a gray cloak, pressed both palms together until the knuckles shone. No trumpet sounded. They watched a god make forbearance of his own voice. The immediate effect was not the shattering they had wanted. Where the lightning threads touched the tower, the iron rings on which the Dark Lord had hung, his thought seemed to vibrate as if someone had plucked strings. The great eye, the lamp that had burned in men's nightmares, did not blaze outward. Instead, it constricted for a space and then flared with a furious red that was not wholly light, but something wronger, a color like a blister. From that flare came a smell, a faint stinging of rot, and then a silence that rolled like a tide outwards. Sauron felt the tug. His will reached to grasp and then found another hand already between him and his quarry. The tether had bought a moment, moments of fine things and dangerous. In the tether's first moments, birds fell from their flight and lay twitching in sudden airless wind. Young folk of the scattered folk wrenched at the sleeves of their companions. Old men cried without sound. The fence of sound that the ring raised to entangle thunder sent a cold up people's spines. For those who knew songs heard at once a new counter-melody, winding under the thunder's tom. Where once Thor's laugh would have been clear and ringing, now there was an undernote, slippery and low. The hammer's own voice had been altered. When Thor moved his hand, a whisper of the ring clung to it, a shadow scent, and for a breath he tasted iron washed in sweet ash. His fingers tightened. The owners of those fingers were not surprised to feel pain or loss. They were surprised to note its character. It was not mortal harm. It was the taking of a habit, a lightness in the chest that had been his when he leapt at battle. "Thor," a voice called, not bold but steadier than some in the plain, "what have you done?" One of the captains who stood closest came forward into the rain. He was no great lord, only a man who had held a banner when fields went black. His voice cracked as if he had swallowed frost. He looked at the way the lightning lay wrapped about stone, and then at Thor. Men love answers. They ask them when they have not the courage for all kinds of silence. Thor turned his head slowly. He smelled the smell of burned meat in the ridgeline of the plain now, and it made him glad that the people had shelter. He could not speak with his old high voice. The offering had taken a little of it. The sound that came from his mouth was lower, edged with thunder, but threaded now by something else, an echo that was not his. He said, "I have tethered thunder to the ring." It was not a boast. The voice had the flat humor of a man who had paid for his war gear with something heavier than coin. It will make Sauron feel the pull and not the whole of the storm. It will give you time, but he did not finish. There are bargains that do not allow a single man's name to be said aloud. The hammer hummed with a long cadence, and the new music reached his bones. In that cadence, Thor began to hear not only Sauron's will, but ideas foreign to any storm, strategies, old promises offered in the mouth of kings, the taste of wearing crowns like gloves. For the space of a breath, he saw how thunder could be taught to govern. Complicated orders, slow and patient. It would not merely break walls. It could instruct walls to hold. It could reskin a people in a language that made them obey before they had reason to refuse. The thought made his chest ice. It also made his fingers tremble with a warrior's hunger. "Hold the line," he told the captains. His words fell into the rain. They were simple. They were not a command to charge. They were a command to wait, to let the cord between him and the dark tower ache and pull. "Gather what you will," he said. "Do not move until you hear me strike." The captains glanced at one another. Some had been ready to charge on signal, to use the lightning's first lashing as mask and madness. Others clung to the habit of caution. The rope of light beat softly. The tower answered with a low, slow tolling now, as if Sauron's will had set lesser bells to ring in his stead. The watch on the ridgeline pressed closer together, oiled hands on spear hafts. Gondor's standard swayed like a throat in a crook of wind. The scattered folk formed their own crooked line, untrained but fearless as dandelion roots. Thor felt a hammer tug as if it had become a living leash. The tether between lightning and ring was not yet finished. It had temperament. It pulled one way while whispering of other delights. He had taught a thing to listen to Sauron and to obey in part, and he had offered therewith a morsel of himself to the teaching. That was the terrible measure, a piece of his thunder heart, tied like a flag to an enemy's pole. He knew with a clarity that cut that the song he had begged for mercy from might, in time, make mercy itself a tool of tyranny. He knew that he had bought a second chance only by lodging a foreign coin in his own chest. Yet, beyond the rope and the slow bell he could see, just as he had seen it when he had struck the hammer before, an opening. Barad-dûr strained outward where the threads pressed. Stone made of hate is not without seam. Sauron hissed and stretched and found, for one thin turning of the world, his gaze divided. It was enough. If it were used wisely, if courage met cunning with the oath of arms kept, the free peoples might yet reach the place where will was made to change its mind. Thor felt the hammer stir in his hand. The new music had still not finished learning him, but the tether held. It promised more than pause. It promised a move. He raised Mjolnir then slowly, as a man lifts a lantern to show the path. Rain spun off the head like beads off old armor. The braid of light singing to the tower hummed under his wrist like a living thing. When he drew back for the first stroke that would follow this binding, his shadow fell across the plain, long and sudden as an omen. The captains braced. The scattered folk took a breath. The dark tower thudded faintly in answer, a heartbeat of stone. Somewhere within that thud, the ring's small voice laughed, and a new sound threaded the thunder like a thin, bright blade. Thor steadied his body. He had bought time, but he had not yet bought safety for his spirit. The wind carried the thin laugh to his ear, and it tasted of kingship and of chains. He placed his free hand upon the haft, palm upon old runes, and felt the tether's current climb toward him. In that current, he found a map of choices, each line a road. He could strike the tower and hope the corrupted thunder would break the dark will. He could hurl himself through the gate and let Mjolnir's tethered rope tear him, and perhaps unmake Sauron by unmaking the very thing that had named him. Or he could let the rope hold and teach the storm a new order, a perilous apprenticeship. The plain waited like a held breath. The rope hummed against the stone of the tower as if it were a man testing the seam of a door. Thor drew in more of the rain's cold into his lungs. His knuckles showed white where the haft met his fist. He moved slow and monumental toward the motion that would decide which of the possible songs would next be sung. The thunder did not end. It softened and lengthened into a single, keening tone that filled the black sky like a bell set to ring until the world remembered its name. Stone split along seams that were older than any speech, and Barad-dûr leaned like a felled oak. Brick grinding on brick, spires collapsing into a sound that was more a long, bitter exhalation than a crash. For an instant, there was no wind at all, only the ringing, as if the very air had been struck and would answer forever. From the rent in the tower, a light came that was not flame nor pure day. It was a torn thing, a brightness that flared with will and then withered, and in that stolen second, the form that men and elves had feared most became uncertain. The lid of Sauron's outward shape was peeled away by lightning not born of this earth, and what had seemed a single, cruel eye was clouded with 1,000 shifting bits of night. The eye did not die, it faltered, slid as if loose upon a face it no longer controlled. Something that had sat upon a throne of will was unseated. The ring, once a throne and a leash, pitched free like a star knocked from a night hand and fell into the ash below, spinning like a coin that had come to fall on a new edge. Silence followed, heavy and stunned. Men in the camps held their breath and did not know why they could feel the taste of iron behind their teeth. Horses stamped the air, smelled of whetstone and of the peculiar metallic hush that comes after great lightning. From that hush there rose a sound, small, stubborn, maddeningly intimate. It was the hammer, turning a note now threaded with the ring's hunger, and it set every heart near it to a tiny, tremulous answering. Thor stood at the center of the ruin, rain beading in his hair like hammered silver. His hand clutched Mjolnir. The other hand was open, soot-streaked, and bore the shape of a binding that was not written upon skin, but felt as if it had been carved into bone. The lightning that had been tethered to his will had returned along the chain of his hammer like a thought sent back along a rope. Where the strike had cleaved and toppled, the air kept a taste of the thing it had touched. Where the lightning had struck the ring had struck back into the hammer. It was not possession in the simple sense. It was a chord struck across two hearts. The hammer would never be wholly Thor's again. Around him, faces were raised, pale, wet, incredulous. Some laughed, some wept. Others could not form either sound and only stared as though at a miracle with a thin smile. From the far lines of the field came the slow shuffling of armor, the creak of shields. Those who had come expecting deliverance found themselves tasting an older, stranger justice. The saving had a residue. It remained in the clothes that had been closest to the cry. In the ringing of stone it clung to the throat like a promise broken and kept. The ring lay where it had landed, not consumed, not buried, merely cast down. It spun on a patch of blackened soil and made a little sound like a bell under cloth. No hand reached for it at once. Eyes went to it, then away, as if it were a wound to be looked at only with averted face. The power that had made kings tremble was sundered from the will that had forged that power, and yet its hunger was not ended. It was freed from a master's command, but not from itself. Where once it had been an instrument of a single cruelty, it now lay loose in the open world, an unguided thing with appetite and cunning. Thor heard that appetite in a new key. The hammer spoke to him with a voice that was not the voice of any god he had known. There were echoes now, A tiny, persistent whisper threaded into the ringing, a note that suggested both promise and demand. It did not command, as Sauron had done. It desired. It wanted. It remembered the sense of ruling and the feel of dominion, and it made the metal of the hammer remember them too. When Thor raised Mjolnir, the note tightened like a string being plucked. He felt it in his jaw and in his chest, and it brought with it a small, cruel clarity. The victory had been bought with a tether. The ring had not been destroyed. It had changed addresses. For a long minute, no one dared speak the name that hung under every breath. The free peoples had won the sound of a victory and had borrowed the cost of it. Their songs would later tell of stone crumbling and of a god's hand. Those songs would not always speak of the hush that followed, of the thing that whispered in a hero's tool. The elders who had watched the sky now watched the hammer. They knew, without the need of words, that bargains could not be sealed without leaving marks. A childless wind tore at Thor's cloak and showed him the faces around, scarred, small, and vast with new uncertainty. He saw men who had fought to the last breath, elves with light like cold fire in their eyes, and something like a shepherd's caution in the shoulders of those who had no more blades to raise. He felt the way they regarded him, not only as Savior, but also as instrument. It is a lonely account when the hands that save are also the hands that bear a new folded weight. He could have offered his hammer for study. He could have thrown it into the sea and tried to bury the hunger so that no one might hear it again. He did not do these things. Instead, he lifted Mjolnir and listened. The note inside it was not quite a voice. It was memory and appetite woven thin and pressed into the metal like a seam. In it lived the ring's dream of rule, and in it lived the echo of every will it had ever touched. To attempt the destruction of that memory by force would be to cleave the world with blows no living thing could bear. To hide the hammer would be to give that hunger a shadow in which to breathe and wait. Neither offered a clean answer. The old gods are not wholly blind to consequence. Thor felt a cold that was not wind run through him, as if a law beyond his kin had remarked upon what he had done. He knew, with the simplicity of a thunderclap, what exile would mean. Not banishment as men understand it, rather the change that comes when one who has crossed the bounds of a realm must withdraw to prevent that realm's corruption. He did not speak of this to the captains and captains' wives. He did not speak it to himself until the thought had knotted in his throat and there was no turning. When the first of the free peoples moved, not in triumph, but in the halting steps of those who have touched a thing too terrible and too sweet, Thor turned away. Those nearest him saw only a god's stillness as he walked. Behind him, Barad-dûr lay wasted like an old wound. Before him, the land felt fragile as ash. He did not march like one who had merely won. He walked like one who had taken upon his back something not his to carry, yet had chosen to carry it, because leaving it would have been a worse theft. He chose exile not because the war demanded it, but because mercy did. To stay among these fields while the hammer sang a note of desire would be to teach the land a new longing. To remain in halls where folk would look to the thunder as a guarantee would be to make them smaller, to bind their hope to a power that now carried a borrowed hunger. Better, Thor decided, that he leave the stage he had entered than that he become its permanent shadow. The choice bent him. It did not break him. Around him, people said about tending wounds and gathering the brave and broken. There would be councils and decisions and 1,000 small reckonings in which the little necessities of rebuilding would overtake the larger questions of fate. Men would write poetry that made him a hero. Children would take sticks and pretend to be a thunderer who came down and blew the dark tower over with a clap. Elves would speak of the seam in the sky and add it to their songs as a lament. But Thor's exit had the hush of a storm that does not leave rain behind. His was a leaving that would be felt long after the tracks of his feet were gone. As he went, he pressed the hammer close and felt the whispering increase, not sharp, but patient, like coals coaxed under ash. There was a contract between lightning and will, and that contract sang in his bones. He had freed a world from a tyrant's gaze, yet he had not freed the thing that made that tyrant terrible. It now rested in a new place, and the note of its desire had been forever set into the instrument of its undoing. Whether that was mercy or stain would be a question for ages. A small figure, not a leader, not yet, but old enough to know the weight of small things, moved toward where the ring lay. The path of that movement was slow and full of shadowed hesitance, as if the foot that would step forward must measure the possibility of every doom. Not all hands would touch the ring, not all eyes would meet it. The very air around it made men shy, yet something pulled. It is the way of the world that what is needed is most often what is dreaded. Thor stopped and watched the figures approach, and in that brief mutual glance there was the passing judgment of two kinds of strength, one that redeems with a chosen burden, and one that must reckon with the burden laid before it. He could say nothing that would unbind the choice on which the small figure now pondered. He could only let his exile begin. He turned his face to the sea. The sky above him gathered its gray and silver, and the hammer at his side gave out the same low, endless note. It was no longer only his thunder. It carried a memory that would not sleep, an ache that would sharpen the edge of every storm he raised. He would go, not because he wished to vanish, but because he had chosen to be the place where a wound might be kept from spreading. His steps were heavy. They were also determined. Behind him, in the ash, lay the ring, the toppled tower, and the slow, uncertain steps of a people beginning to choose what of their fate they would hold and what they would let go. As Thor walked toward the white of the sea, the hammer at his side hummed a single insistent thread, and the land behind him began, very slowly, to make plans that would not ignore what had been bought with thunder. The future moved toward them like tide, bringing with it 1,000 small reckonings and one large unanswered hunger.